All right, since we are now at time, we're going to go ahead and begin tonight's Kumi session. Thank you to everyone who is with us right now, especially to our special guest of this week, Tariq Habash. My name is Lily, and our topic today is U.S. support of Israel, and we are looking forward to our presentation from Tariq. Just as a brief overview for everyone, Tariq, since you're joining us, and if anyone is new here, the first part of our meeting will be dedicated to our guest, including a time of Q&A afterwards. And then please stay around for the final 10 to 15 minutes of the call when we dedicate our time to our weekly Kumi actions. In addition to continuing last week's action, which is sharing the Kairos Palestine's global call for action for Nakba Day, we will be doing a time of sharing in our communities of things that are happening locally. So stick around for the end after our presentation of this week. And before we begin, I just want to remind everyone that this session is being recorded and will be shared after the event. So make sure your mic is off at this time and then take this into consideration if you have the opportunity to speak during the webinar. Just know that you're being recorded. And that being said, we'll be collecting questions for our speaker during the presentation via Q&A in the chat. So if you have a question at any point during the presentation, be sure to put that in the chat, and we will ask it after finished. So at this time, I want to introduce this week's guest. Many of you are likely aware of Tariq Habash, who made headlines this January when he became the second U.S. government official and the only political appointee to resign from the administration, the Biden administration, due to its policy on Gaza and unrestricted support for Israel's aggression against Palestinians. He was a political advisee, a political appointee, and policy advisor in the Department of Education's Office of Planning, Education, and Policy Development, and he worked to overhaul the broken student loan system, provide relief to millions of borrowers, and address inequalities across American higher education. So, Tariq, thank you so much for being with us. It's truly an honor, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Lily, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm really excited for the conversation and just to talk a little bit about my experience and also about how U.S. policy in support of Israel has really developed, particularly in recent months. Like Lily mentioned, I was a government official who recently resigned from the administration, but I was also the only political appointee to do so. And even now, 7 months after October 7th and the tens of thousands of innocent Palestinian lives that we've seen lost and millions who are suffering from a manufactured famine by the Israeli government, there haven't been any other political appointees who represent the president and his agenda who have publicly resigned. And I say publicly because I know of many of my former colleagues who actually have taken a leave from the federal government over the president's ongoing policies in Gaza. But so many of them didn't feel inclined to publicly resign for personal reasons, for professional reasons. And I think that really speaks to the level of concern about what it means to be in the United States today and to take such a public position against the unrestricted and unconditional support that the United States government has for Israel. And it's just something that before Josh Paul and I, you never saw people resign from the United States government over Israel policy. That wasn't something that happened because the United States has long been the most staunch supporter of the Israeli government, of the Israeli occupation, of the continued unequal treatment of Palestinian lives. And I think that what we have seen over the last few months is that there is space for people to raise their voices, to raise concerns about inequitable policies, about dangerous policies about enabling extreme violence and ethnic cleansing and genocide that we have been seeing. And we're seeing it from people who previously worked in the government. We're seeing it from college students across the world. We're seeing it from the halls of Congress, despite it being far too few of elected officials. We are starting to see this kind of break from the unconditional support of Israel. And what I'm going to talk a little bit about today is kind of what has been happening in terms of U.S. policy regarding Israel and regarding Palestine, essentially since my resignation, because I feel like my resignation letter, if for those who haven't seen it, I did detail a lot of the things that kind of led to my resignation. And I think President Biden has been really uh, arguably the most staunch supporter of Israel for decades, dating back to his early days in the United States Senate as a senator from Delaware. He has repeatedly called himself a Zionist. He has repeatedly said that if Israel did not exist, we would have to create Israel. He has repeatedly taken positions against equality for Palestinians and in support of unconditional support for Israel. And despite having worked for him and having been appointed by his administration to represent his agenda on education issues here domestically in particular, I think the president, both in the campaign and in the early days of the administration, showed a capacity to acknowledge when he had been wrong previously. And he had shown a capacity to say, I was wrong on bankruptcy issues back in the 90s. I was wrong on gun related legislation in the past. I was wrong on Iraq and Afghanistan. I was wrong on civil rights issues very early on. And I have corrected for a lot of those things. And from my perspective, as a younger Palestinian American, I felt that his willingness to acknowledge where he had been wrong might allow for him to acknowledge that there has been a history of systemic oppression of Palestinians, that he could also recognize that he had been wrong in his previous unconditional support for Israel's occupation of the West Bank of Gaza, of Palestinian land. And unfortunately, I was wrong about that. It seems like he quadrupled down on his policies, and that's what we've seen. So I have a long list of things that have been happening in the United States, because obviously this is arguably one of the biggest issues that is really facing the United States today. And I have a long list of things, but it's no surprise that a lot of the things that are on my list of U.S. policies and actions that have happened over recent months are things that you are all probably aware of. We've seen numerous vetoes from the United States in the United Nations Security Council, vetoing humanitarian pause proposals, vetoing ceasefires and hostage release resolutions. And at the same time as all that was happening, we've seen the United States simultaneously continue not to follow its own laws, whether it's the Leahy Law, which prohibits providing weapons to specific units that are violating international humanitarian law. We're continuing to provide those weapons. And in fact, there have been numerous instances where the United States has actually sent Israel over $250 million of weapons without congressional approval. And I think that raises some very legitimate and real concerns about the executive powers and the executive branch really circumventing the legal processes, both for providing weapons, but also providing weapons in circumstances where we really shouldn't be providing weapons. Even when there have been resolutions that extended beyond the Security Council, the United States voted no on the General Assembly resolutions for ceasefire and hostage release. following South Africa's lawsuit accusing of Israel of genocide and the ICJ's decision, the United States representatives, the spokespeople from both the State Department and the National Security Council, have essentially called the claims made by South Africa, which were extremely thorough. I think it was an 84-page lawsuit, and we called it meritless, counterproductive, and completely without any basis in fact whatsoever, which is a pretty aggressive repudiation of a legal document that was taken very seriously by the International Court of Justice and actually had preliminary findings, which I think raises concerns, pretty significant ones, about where the United States is relative to the rest of the world, which also isn't surprising. But within the same day, not only did we make those types of combative arguments about the legal arguments that were being made, we also simultaneously suspended aid to UNRWA, which is, as you know, one of probably the most influential humanitarian aid organization infrastructure within Gaza and within that has the capacity and capability of providing support and relief to Palestinian civilians. And not only was our suspension of UNRWA funds really substantial because the United States historically has been the largest donor to UNRWA, but it facilitated over a dozen other countries to do the same. And despite those efforts to undermine UNRWA, we took that action based on accusations of illegal actions or quote unquote collaboration of UNRWA employees with Hamas on October 7th, despite what has been repeatedly reported that there wasn't substantiating evidence to corroborate those accusations. And approximately half of the countries have now reinstated UNRWA funding. The United States, being the prior largest donor to UNRWA, did not reinstate funding, has not reinstated funding, but actually took a step further and passed legislation, and the president signed that legislation to suspend UNRWA funding during the continued famine that over 1 million Palestinians are facing in Gaza, which I think raises even more concerns about the role that the United States government continues to play in the escalating humanitarian crisis that we're seeing. There was another ceasefire and hostage release UN resolution in the Security Council that the United States vetoed shortly after. Eventually, we abstained. We didn't support the resolution that ultimately passed, but we did abstain after watering down the language, but then subsequently undermined that resolution by calling it non-binding, even though it was a UN Security Council resolution that passed. This effectively allowed Israel during Ramadan to not seriously negotiate a ceasefire agreement that we ultimately never saw. And what that has really led to is the circumstances that we're looking at today, which is that we haven't really taken the real necessary steps to condemn the now imminent and arguably happening right now Rafah invasion. And I think this is really concerning because there's 600,000 children currently in Rafah. There is over 1.3 million Palestinians that are living there, and they're being forced to evacuate to an area that does not have running water, that does not have sufficient shelter. People aren't going to be able to effectively survive. And I think it's really dangerous because President Biden has repeatedly hinted at or indicated that Rafah could be a red line if Israel doesn't have a real plan to address the humanitarian concerns. I think that human rights experts, humanitarian experts, State Department officials who I've spoken to do not think that there is a plan, do not think that there is a way to actually do this safely and that also preserves as many innocent lives as possible. Yet the president and the administration haven't taken sufficient actions to make it clear that an invasion under those circumstances cannot happen. And yet we're watching it happen right now. And for the last 48 hours, begin and speed up very rapidly. In addition to that, while all of this was happening just a few weeks ago, the House and Senate passed supplemental appropriations legislation, so essentially funding that would provide more than $14 billion in military funding to Israel on top of the $3.8 billion they already receive annually. This would be 14 billion more in military funding and billions more in other types of funding. There were a couple of attempts by legislators to amend the legislation to exclude offensive weapons. Those amendments were not adopted. So there were absolutely no restrictions. There was no effort to try and create a red line in that legislation to prevent an invasion of Rafah. There were no restrictions on the types of weapons that could be provided. It was essentially continued unrestricted support, which continues to allow what we're watching happening in real time take place. So while that was happening, we're also continuing to send Israel more weapons amid all of the international humanitarian law violations, including targeting of humanitarian aid workers from multiple humanitarian aid organizations like UNRWA and World Central Kitchen. And even though there was a lot of condemnation about some of those attacks, we continued to move forward with the legislation that provided that funding. And I think part of the reason for the expediting of that was that there were even attempts by Israel to escalate the conflict from just Gaza to regional escalation. And there was no public condemnation of the attempts for regional escalation, including Israel's attack on an Iranian embassy, which I think raises very real concerns. However, there were condemnations of Iran's subsequent attack on Israel. And so I think that, again, shows the double-edged sword that we continue to see in terms of how the United States is willing to communicate about Israel's policies in the region. Further, the supplemental legislation also included a ban to the social media app TikTok. That ban was signed by President Biden, which essentially censors how news and media can be consumed in the United States. Companies like Meta, which is the owner of Facebook and of Instagram, as well as like Twitter or X, have already taken steps to aggressively censor posts and speech on Palestine. TikTok, because it is not U.S. owned, was not taking similar steps to censor speech. I think that in part was a driving factor to pushing a TikTok ban in the United States. And now TikTok is essentially on a clock. If they do not sell the company from Chinese ownership, it's likely that you will not be able to use or access TikTok in the United States in the next year. Other things that are happening in the United States, we've seen a serious weaponization of language happening. The United States House of Representatives has, in numerous committees, has held hearings to redefine the narrative about what's happening across the United States, particularly on college campuses regarding nonviolent protests. The House of Representatives has previously voted to censure Rashida Tlaib, who is the only Palestinian member of Congress, and they did that for her use of the phrase "from the river to the sea," which has historically been used to as a phrase to talk about Palestinian liberation and equality for Palestinians, and has in the last 7 months been redefined by a lot of bad faith actors and right-wing extremists to be synonymous with the expulsion of Jewish people from from Israel, and to in some cases even claims that the river to the sea means to kill Jews, which I don't think anyone in good faith believes that that is the meaning of that phrase or the intention of someone like Rashida Tlaib when she uses that phrase. Even today, there is an effort by Republicans in Congress to try and censure Ilhan Omar, who is a Muslim member of Congress. And these efforts to silence progressives who have been pro-Palestinian for a long time are also happening while there are members of Congress who have repeatedly used genocidal and dehumanizing rhetoric to describe Palestinians, yet there haven't been any condemnations from congressional bodies or even from the administration when members of Congress say flatten Gaza, kick all the Palestinians out of Gaza, making all Palestinians synonymous with Hamas and October 7th. Those types of comments don't receive the same condemnation that that calls for justice or peace or ceasefire receive from progressive, and I think that's really problematic. I did mention the weaponization of language, and I think it's really important to talk about how the hearings that Republicans have held around the rise in anti-Semitism on college campuses have attempted to redefine what it means when they say anti-Semitism. We've seen a number of members of Congress try and conflate legitimate criticism of the Israeli government with anti-Semitism, which creates a really, really dangerous precedent if that were to become law, because what it actually does is to attempt to try and tie the responsibility of Israel's actions to all Jewish people. And when you do that, you make the people who are being accused of anti-Semitism because they are criticizing a foreign government less safe. But arguably more dangerous is that you're also making Jewish people significantly less safe because you are undermining what real and dangerous hate of Jewish people looks like. And you're also trying to tie the violent actions of an authoritarian regime in Israel's government and what they are doing to Palestinians, the majority of whom are civilians and women and children. You're trying to tie that to Jewish people rather than to the government that is actually making those decisions and taking those actions. And that makes Jewish people substantially less safe. So I think it's really important to also acknowledge that this isn't just happening in hearings. This is happening when you have state legislatures trying to pass laws adopting a broader definition of anti-Semitism. There's even laws in Congress right now that I'll talk a little bit about that are moving as we speak. The House passed a proposed bill last week that would adopt the IRA definition that does consider criticisms of Israel as anti-Semitic. And so when you bake that into the law, it's really dangerous, both from a civil rights perspective, but also from a freedom of expression, freedom of speech perspective as well, which is something that is protected in the United States. Other types of weaponization of language that we've seen, I mentioned river to the sea, but we've also seen the weaponization in these hearings of Arabic words such as intifada. Intifada means uprising, but more literally it means shaking off in Arabic. And when you think about the shaking off of oppression and the shaking off of the occupation of people and of injustice, that is not a call to violence in any way. But what we've heard from members of Congress, from Republicans in particular, is that intifada means killing Jews. And it does not mean that. It's not the intention of the word. It's not the definition of the word if you understand Arabic. And I think that's a really important point, is that what we're seeing is more and more often the censorship of speech, the redefining of language to fit narratives that will suppress dissent, particularly on college campuses, but also just more broadly across the country in the halls of power, in the media. And that's what's happening every single day here in the United States. but also around the world, particularly in Europe as well. And I'm sure that people have seen, but there have been really substantial actions across college campuses, particularly in the last couple of weeks after the United States passed the supplemental appropriations to give Israel billions of dollars of more money and weapons. The latest count that I've seen is over 150 solidarity encampments. So these are essentially students going onto college campuses, their own campuses, where they pay tuition and they go to school and they take classes and they often live on campus. And they're taking tents and they're establishing these solidarity encampments to show solidarity with the Palestinian people who have been displaced from their homes in Gaza, who now are living in tents, who are suffering under the weight of billions of dollars of weapons being dropped on them every single day. And these students are saying, we have to stop this. This is not okay. This is not acceptable. We don't want our tax dollars to go toward the massacre of Palestinians. We don't want our tax dollars going to the starvation of Palestinians. And we certainly don't want our tuition dollars and the money that our universities are saving through their endowments to be invested in the destruction of Palestinians. We want transparency in where those dollars are going that we are spending to come to school here. And we want to make sure that it is divested from violence and from what Israel is doing to Palestinians. And unfortunately, the way that university leaders have responded has been through scare tactics, through repression, and in a lot of cases, unfortunately, through violence. They've attempted numerous ways to shut down these solidarity encampments that have been nonviolent. They have been peaceful. Now, I think a lot of people have talked about the concerns by some students that feel like they don't feel safe in these areas. But when you actually go to these encampments, they are not there to threaten. They are not there to instill fear. They are challenging the status quo of U.S. policy in Israel. But that's a very different thing than creating an unsafe environment. And I think people can be uncomfortable without being unsafe. And I think that's what's happening when you talk about these student protests that are nonviolent. And that's a really important distinction to make because schools and university leaders, in their attempts to shut down these encampments, have talked about sowing disorder. They've talked about unlawfulness. But I think we've seen historically that protests and often student protests and student activism have been peaceful, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are lawful. That doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just means that our laws have to develop more to understand where we are in society today. And I think we saw that with protests from Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, who have been arrested in the past, historically during the civil rights movement. We saw it during the protests of the Vietnam War. We saw it during the protests of South Africa apartheid. This is just another instance where I think we are seeing injustice happen in real time, and our laws are not equipped to acknowledge that these students have a real right to nonviolent civil disobedience, which is what they're engaging in. We've also seen university leaders literally call the police on their own students, and the police have subsequently used pretty aggressive force against students and faculty who have often stood in solidarity with their students and attempted to protect them. We've seen police at UCLA use rubber bullets and shoot students in the face. At Columbia, when students were in what they renamed Hind Hall, police entered and forced students out. And there were reports that there was gunfire that went off in the building. And thank goodness no one was hurt by that gunfire. But the reality is, when you bring police and you bring the National Guard, like the University of Texas saw a few weeks ago, when you see police presence across the country, it escalates the circumstances. It makes students less safe. And so university leaders are actually the ones that are creating a less safe learning environment because their interest is more in maintaining the status quo and in maintaining order rather than maintaining safety and maintaining a place for students to discuss difficult issues. We've also seen university leaders try and equate the actions of these peaceful protesters with anti-Semitism. I talked a little bit about that already. This is happening not just with legislation, but it's happening with university policies. It's happening with university communications about what students are saying. But when you hear what the students are asking for and what they're calling for, they have been very clear. They've been very consistent with their messaging. We've also seen university leaders refuse to engage entirely with students on the substance of their concerns. And we've even seen universities shut down commencements and ceremonies. That's what's happening on college campuses. That's a really big component of all this. I'm going to try and wrap up my section here so people can ask questions. But in addition to all of this, there are a number of different types of actions that are being considered when it comes to federal policy. There have been numerous calls, letters, amendments related to enforcing 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act, National Security Memorandum 20, and Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act. These are all essentially like different ways of ensuring that weapons are not going to a foreign country where humanitarian aid is not being accessed, making sure that that weapons are not going somewhere where international humanitarian law is being violated. Have been conversations about reinstating UNRWA. I don't know. I haven't looked this week, but I believe that there hasn't been legislation introduced to date, but there may have been legislation introduced, so don't quote me on that. There have also, on the other end of the spectrum, as I mentioned, there have been multiple pieces of legislation to redefine anti-Semitism. There's two different bills. One of them has already been voted on in the House and passed overwhelmingly. That legislation essentially adopts the IRA definition, which includes and conflates legitimate criticism of a foreign government, of the Israeli government, with anti-Semitism. As I mentioned, that's really dangerous. Another piece of legislation creates a special classification for anti-Semitism that doesn't exist for any other type of discrimination, including anti-Arab hate, anti-Black hate, etc. And I think that's a really important point. When I worked at the Department of Education, it's a civil rights agency. As an agency that was created in the wake of the civil rights movement, the Department of Education's primary purpose is to protect and provide equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of race, gender, religion, shared ancestry, and that includes preventing discrimination based on those categories. And when it comes to making a determination about discrimination, that is a really complex and complicated process to analyze whether real discrimination is taking place. There is not a definition for anti-Black hate. There is not a definition for Islamophobia. There's not a definition for anti-Semitism or anti-Arab hate. It is evaluated based on circumstance on a case-by-case basis. It is extremely thorough. It takes a really long time to get through all of those components, but that is in part because it is so important to get these things right. And when you define something with such broad strokes, like what these pieces of legislation are trying to do for anti-Semitism, and creating a specialized classification for a particular type of discrimination over another, it undermines both the analysis that's done to determine whether there is real discrimination happening, but it also undermines all the other types of discrimination that continue to happen and makes it less effective when we try to prevent that discrimination. So it's really, really important to push back on these broad definitions when we're talking about anti-Semitism, or if we're talking about Islamophobia or anti-Arab hate or anti-Palestinian hate. It's really important that we are clear about what it looks like, but that we understand that it can happen in different circumstances. And right now, the reason that these legislations are being pushed is effectively to limit speech across the country. The last piece of legislation that I think is starting to move really quickly, and I think already passed the House, would essentially give the Treasury Secretary really broad discretion to revoke nonprofit status and eligibility in circumstances where an organization is determined to, quote unquote, be a terrorist supporting organization. And on its face, that doesn't seem concerning. I don't think it should be. I don't think we want to necessarily have organizations have nonprofit status and be terrorist supporting, but what is actually happening is, again, the redefining of what that means and what that looks like. And when you consider that legislation alongside numerous recent lawsuits against nonprofit organizations that have historically defended Palestinian rights as being classified as Hamas affiliated or Hamas supporters, it creates this really dangerous precedent where one individual in an administration can just decide that any organization that has historically stood up for justice for Palestinians is no longer eligible to be a nonprofit and will then be attacked in a number of other ways because that administration does not support the work that organization is doing. So I think that's a really important thing to also call out. I just talked a lot. I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tariq. As many have said in the chat, this was such a comprehensive overview of just the many, many, many issues in the US right now. I think you covered topics that we have covered in our actions over previous months. I remember we did actions regarding the censorship of Rashida Tlaib and just all the way up until this point. And the many issues you addressed as far as how we define our terms and our narratives are something that Sabeel is doing with our upcoming conference in November. We've been doing a number of webinars on how we define anti-Semitism and Zionism and Islamophobia and these things. So I think everything that you shared is very relevant and contextual to our audience here. So thank you. I want to remind everyone to just put your questions in the chat if you have. We have a few minutes to answer some questions. I think I'll just ask a question of my own, and then maybe if Salim has questions either, we'll do this. But what was new to me was hearing about the legislation upcoming to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism in the US. Can you give a bit more analysis on, what will the implications of that be sort of for universities and NGOs? And do you foresee that that's something that will end up being passed?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I don't know for sure if the Senate is going to take up the legislation to even vote on it. It passed the House. So just for context for folks who don't pay as close of attention to the United States Congress, the Senate is currently has a very, very small majority of Democrats, and the House has a very small majority of Republicans. And so some things will move in one body, but will be stopped in the other because there are different priorities for the different political parties. And I think issues related to Israel are interesting because United States support is so broadly pro-Israel in a bipartisan way that a lot of those pieces will move. So it's very possible that something that represses dissent against the Israeli government could still move. But I think for Democrats who have historically been civil rights focused, I think there is a level of concern about the conflation of anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel or anti-Zionism as being anti-Semitic. But there are a lot of Democrats that do believe that even legitimate criticism of Israel is in part anti-Semitic. And I think that is a really dangerous thing. So as we're talking about calls to action, if you're in the United States and you have a senator that you can call, you should be calling them and raising those concerns that this is like, these are two very different things. And it shouldn't be United States policy for us to repress dissent against a foreign government because we support that country. We don't even do that for our own government. I'm allowed to criticize Joe Biden, and I'm a Democrat. But even if I wasn't, as a US citizen, I have every right to criticize my own government. Why would we prevent our own citizens from criticizing another government? That is beyond me in terms of being an American. It doesn't really align with my American values or ideals. It doesn't align with our own Constitution. And so making sure that that is communicated to our elected officials is really important. In terms of what it would do on college campuses, I think it would have a very real chilling effect for how we talk about a lot of these particular issues, not just in terms of speech and protest, but even about education. when I was in college, I studied the region, I studied the Middle East, and I had multiple classes about the ongoing history and conflict of Israel Palestine. And I think that even curriculum could be affected by legislation that determines that legitimate criticism of Israel could be anti-Semitic. And you might see a change in how universities even talk about this issue in the classroom, outside of the classroom, and I think that's really dangerous. And it's not enough for U.S. Congress not to do it. Like I said, this is happening in terms of university policies. Universities may be adopting the IRA definition for their own policies. And so even in circumstances where U.S. law doesn't consider the IRA definition, it is still very possible that universities try and use the broad definition as a way to stifle dissent from students or faculty on this issue, or to stop calls for divestment from Israel. There are a lot of different ways that this can really play out. And there have been states that have already passed this. I believe South Dakota was the first state to actually adopt the IRA definition. They've already done it. So this is happening at every level of government. It is happening at the institutional level. And it's something that needs to be taken really seriously because the consequences are pretty extreme. And I think this is kind of mirroring what we saw in terms of anti-BDS legislation years ago across the United States, where more than half of the states in the country have essentially adopted language that says that like it is illegal to support the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement against Israel, which is a wild thing for individual states to take on and limit the civil liberties of their own residents.
Yes, there's a lot of questions that are coming up in the chat. Um, I mean, I also have two questions, if I can, as a Palestinian who's here. One, which probably will be a very big question, answer for it, is all of what you're sharing. For me, the question that comes to my mind is why? Why Israel, why the United States government is so obsessed about this? Why are the states are taking these legislations? Why are they so like why? Why is this happening? Why are they so about Israel and not criticizing Israel, as you said? And my second question, which I think it's a long shot, it's further down the road, but it is a fear of how we think here as Palestinians living in Palestine. um, we feel part of the political kind of ongoing, situation is that basically Netanyahu is kind of like, you know, how do you say it, delaying the whole situation. This is how we say it. So basically, so for people to understand that Netanyahu is delaying the whole situation and keeping the war ongoing until the elections happen in the states. For what we see, that if it happens that Trump takes back again, basically that will be worse for us. But this is how we see it. Now, is it, as what do you think, Tariq? I mean, is it true? I mean, I don't know if if that is a question I could ask, but is it true? It'll be worse? It'll be not? I mean, should we prepare
Yeah,
ourselves for the worst? I don't know.
I think it's a great question. I mean, I'm not a fan of Trump. I'm not afraid to say that. As a Palestinian American who lived in the United States his whole life, I see the dangers of Trump. But I think it's hard to say that in this moment, after what we've seen the last 7 months from Biden, that like Trump could be worse. Like, how much worse can Trump be in this moment? I don't know the answer. I'm not saying that Trump will be better by any means or by any stretch. I mean, I think that he's extremely dangerous, but Biden is facilitating and enabling a genocide of Palestinians right now. And Trump is a very self interested individual. And I think there's another argument to be made that Trump will see how upset so many Americans are about what's happening, and he might change the policy because it will be favorable for him. You know, I don't know if that's necessarily true because I also think that he has proven to be not a friend of Palestinians in the past. He was the president that moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He was the one that originally cut off funding to UNRWA without any reason, but he zeroed it out in his budget. There are a lot of things that Trump has done that have not been supportive of Palestinians. So I don't want to say that he is going to be better, but I don't know if he can be much worse. I do think that, to your point, I mean, maybe Netanyahu's trying to wait out the U.S. election. I think he's trying to wait out his own calls for his own reelection, because I think that I think what we're seeing in Israel is even frustration about the government and the actions the government is taking, not necessarily because they disagree with everything that he's doing, but maybe because he's not prioritizing returning the hostages, and he's not trying to reach a ceasefire agreement to be able to bring people home who have not been there for 7 months. So I think there's a lot, at least from what we're seeing from the United States, I think there's a lot of different reasons, but we've even seen criticism in the United States of Netanyahu from, I mean, Biden fakes criticism, but I think like we saw a legitimate criticisms coming from Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, who is the majority leader in the Senate, but we are also seeing invitations from the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, to Netanyahu to come to the United States Capitol and to speak, and Chuck Schumer supporting Netanyahu coming to the United States. So I think we're getting a lot of mixed messages about that. And I think to your earlier question, well, why is there such big support for Israel in the United States, and why is there all the justifications for what they continue to do? And I think we've seen decades of political support for Israel, because we've seen more political activism in the United States for supporting Israel as well. I think there's been an Israeli lobby in the United States for a long time that has worked very hard to build support for Israel in the United States. And I think that has led to a point where we are now, where there hasn't been the same level of needed Palestinian activism and support for Palestinian lives and justice for Palestinians and an end to occupation in the United States, particularly in the political realm. And I think that is something that we're seeing change very quickly. But you know, we're decades behind in terms of the political infrastructure and activity and support in U.S. politics that has led to where we are today. Lily, do you want to ask?
Yeah, I think
person?
just going through a few of the things that I've asked in the chat, I want to focus on one question that was really practical, which is when we're doing this sort of activism and calling our representatives, how do we counter our reps who are really unaware of a different view of a situation than what's usually offered them, kind of probably by the pro-Israel lobby, and who also want to keep climbing the congressional ladder? Is there wording that we can use? Are there strategies that we can be using to be the most effective in our demands?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. It's something that I've actually heard a lot from local officials, from state level officials, and from federal officials, including members of Congress, is that they haven't heard a different perspective. And I think it's important to call them out on that. I think that the majority of Americans disagree with U.S. current policy with respect to Gaza. If they aren't hearing a different perspective other than full unrestricted support to Israel, then they are not listening. They're not trying to hear other perspectives. And just because someone is not necessarily calling your office every single day, expressing the same thing over and over again, doesn't mean that there isn't a different perspective. But I also know for a fact that there are people calling every single office every single day, raising concerns about U.S. policy. So I think calling them out and saying, that's just not true, because I know people who have called your office and other people have called your office, and I have been calling your office raising these concerns. The least that you could do is not gaslight me and acknowledge that there are a lot of people out there who are expressing concerns about your continued position on this issue. I think that's number one, because they like to hide behind that that curtain that, well, I haven't heard anything, so why would I take a different position? And it's not true. So you have to call them out on that, number one. I think number two, in terms of messaging, I think, making it clear that this is, a moral issue. It's something that affects people directly, and explaining why it's personal is really important. Personalizing it, humanizing Palestinians. I think that's really powerful. That's what I always try to do as a Palestinian American, is center my humanity, because my entire life as a Palestinian here in the United States, I have felt like I've needed to justify that I am just as deserving of love and peace and life as anyone else. And I think that's just something that, when we think about numbers and we think about like people being across the other side of the world, like sometimes it's just really important to tell a story, whether it's your story, whether it's a story of a Palestinian refugee who you've spoken to, or a story that you've heard, or a picture that you saw. Centering that is really powerful, and I think is compelling. And I think having real next steps, or like tangible actions that the person can take, whether it's making a statement, whether it's taking a vote a certain way, like asking for something tangible, so that they can't just say, well, you told me this nice thing, it was a great story and I really appreciated it, and I felt it in my heart, but I don't know what to do about it. So giving them real tangible steps, so that they can't say, well, I don't know what to do. I mean, they know what to do, they just don't want to do it. So I think making it clear, this is what is happening, this is how it's bothering me, here is a humanizing anecdote or story, and this is what you can do about it, and this is why you have to do it. I think that is how you get through. I think beyond that, I don't want to make this like too like political facing, but like there are mechanisms and infrastructures and grassroots organizations that you can join, and political actions that you can take collectively that have a much bigger impact than maybe on an individual level. So when you're thinking about donating, instead of donating in a way that it's $20 to one person at one time, going through a pack that represents the values that you hold in a way that when that message is coming through, it's not, oh, you received all these small dollar donations. Well, you received these donations, but also these donations are under the auspices of you have an obligation to support U.S. law, to prevent violations of U.S. law and international humanitarian law, and preserve life. And that's what this money is for. And I think that's really impactful.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's super clear, and I think is an encouragement and an instruction to all of us as we continue. I would say probably maybe about 50% of the people on this call are from the US context, and the rest of you, thank you for bearing with us this week as we've specifically focused on US support, but at this moment in history, it's also extremely important. So Tariq, I just want to thank you again for your time and just your clarity, and also just the sacrifice that you have made in your career as an individual. I think you are on the right side of history, and we are all really grateful for your example. And certainly hope that your continued activism and work, makes a difference. I can at least say for the Sabeel community and the Kumi community that it is. So thank you once again.
Thank you all. Thanks so much.
We have about 5 minutes left in our time this week, which is okay because we don't have a new action for this week, but I do just want to once more go over the Nakba letter from last week's action, which I know Tan went over with us, but I just want to reiterate the specific call about using certain language, which in light of our presentation today, is very, very important. So just give me one moment and I'm going to share my screen. So as many of you know, Nakba Day is this coming Wednesday, May 15th. And next week's Kumi session will be focused on Nakba Day. We have a guest, Yaqub Ode, to speak about the Nakba. He's from the village of Lifta, which is the last remaining Palestinian village in the Jerusalem area. But our action this week and next week is continuing to focus on this call from Kairos Palestine. And I think the simplest part of the call to action is using certain language, which is the terms apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. And so the Kairos Palestine movement has pleaded with Christians around the world to use these terms to describe the realities that your Palestinian siblings are experiencing. All three of these terms are defined under international law. And the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, declared in January that Israel is plausibly committing genocide, which, as mentioned in our presentation tonight, we have not seen the accountability of this call. And in the March 24 report, Anatomy of a Genocide, Francesca Albanese concludes that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the threshold indicating Israel's commission of genocide is met. So as a community, we want to stand with Kairos and Kairos Palestine in this call and continue to circulate this document. I'll make sure that this is shared in the chat in a moment, but it's a call to churches, to the international community, and to our local community and civil society groups. And the link to this is available in our newsletter and will be posted in the chat in just a moment. Just in our final few minutes, if people have been able to share this document and promote the message, please write in the chat that you've been able to do so. And I just want to echo some of the comments that have been left to please continue to contact your elected officials, voice your concern and opposition to the invasion of Rafah, as we've seen in the news even today and yesterday, that Palestinians are once again evacuating from Eastern Rafah specifically. So as many of you are continuing to call your representatives, use the language that we learned from Tariq today, and be sure to be calling specifically about the recent events in Rafah. I think at this time, I will let for the final few minutes if anyone wants to share an update of something in their community, please feel free to unmute and then we'll wrap it up. Okay, we have the link to the Kairos document in the chat. Once again, if you didn't yet have that, please encourage you to share this with members in your churches, in your communities, as we prepare for next Wednesday. And the week following our Kumi session, we'll have speakers actually of students from the movements who have been protesting on university campuses. So look forward to that in 2 weeks. And if any of you are near universities where you know that protests are occurring, another action that we didn't formally share, but is always to figure out how you can support the student movements that are occurring on the university campuses near you. So with that, I think we'll conclude our Kumi session today. Once again, thank you to Tariq for his amazing presentation. And thank you all for being with us and for engaging in learning and activism. We'll see you next week.